He signed the paper thinking it would give him power over this house. What he didn't know was that I had signed a different set of papers 2 years before he ever picked up that pen. I was sitting on the back porch when Dennis pulled out of the driveway for the last time. Not because I had asked him to leave. Not exactly. He left because there was nothing left for him here, no leverage, no access, no open door he hadn't yet tried. I heard his truck reverse, heard the gravel spit under the tires, heard the engine fade down Clover Hill Road the same way I had heard 1,000 ordinary sounds over the past 4 years. I didn't go to the window. I just sat with my coffee and watched a cardinal land on the fence post at the edge of the yard. It stayed there for a moment, tilted its head like it was deciding something, then flew off into the oak tree. I thought, that's about right. It wasn't always like this. There was a time, not long after my husband Walter passed, when I thought I might genuinely need someone. Not financially, Walter had left things in good order and I had my pension from 31 years as a school librarian. But the house felt different after he was gone. Too many rooms with no reason for being open. Too many dinners where setting one plate felt like an accusation. I was 64, and I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Dennis had been a friend of a friend, the kind of introduction that happens at church potlucks. He was cheerful in the way men his age sometimes are, when they want to seem uncomplicated. He brought coffee to the table before you asked. He laughed at his own jokes, just long enough to make you feel generous for laughing too. He was attentive in a way I mistook for kindness. I know now that there is a difference between a man who is kind and a man who is strategic about warmth. He started coming around twice a week, then 3 times. Then he was there most days, working on something in the garage or sitting on the porch with a glass of iced tea he'd poured from my pitcher. I didn't stop it. I was lonelier than I admitted, and his presence filled a quiet that had started to feel permanent. The first summer was fine. He fixed the gutter that had been pulling away from the roofline since April. He drove me to my knee appointment in August and waited in the lobby without complaining. He said things like, "You deserve someone looking out for you, Ruth." At 64, after 37 years of being the one looking out for everyone else, those words landed somewhere soft in me. I let them. When he suggested moving in the following spring, he framed it practically. Gas prices, he said. The drive back and forth was wasteful. He had given up his apartment lease anyway. It made sense on paper. I said yes because I thought saying no would mean admitting that something was already bothering me, and I wasn't ready to name it yet. He moved gradually, the way water rises. A box of tools here. A recliner, he said his back needed. Then a television, larger than mine, installed in the living room while I was at my sister's for a long weekend. I came home to it, mounted on my wall, cords tucked against the baseboard, and he stood there looking proud. "Surprise," he said. Thought it would brighten the place up. I thanked him. I said it was thoughtful. I set my bag down and went to start dinner, and thought about how he hadn't asked. The asking became a pattern. Not asking. He stopped asking around the same time he stopped offering. The coffee appeared less often. The garage projects were replaced with long afternoons on his recliner watching cable news at a volume that made the walls hum. When I asked him to turn it down, he looked at me like I had said something unreasonable, and then he turned it down 2 notches and turned it back up after dinner. I'm a woman who spent 31 years teaching children to find information, verify it, and understand what they were reading before they drew any conclusions. I applied those same habits to my own life. I watched. I kept notes in a blue accordion folder I stored on the top shelf of the linen closet behind the spare pillowcases Walter's mother had embroidered. It was not dramatic. It was just careful. The money started as suggestions. Dennis had a way of presenting financial ideas as obvious common sense that only a confused person would question. He mentioned once, casually over eggs, that it might be smart to have a joint account for household expenses, he said. Easier than me covering everything and him paying me back in cash. It sounded reasonable the way his suggestions always sounded reasonable in the morning before I had fully thought them through. I told him I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 days and decided the answer was no. I didn't tell him that. I just thought about it indefinitely and never brought it up again. He brought it up again himself 2 weeks later, and then again in November, this time with numbers. His truck needed work. If we had a joint account, he could just handle it without having to ask. I looked at him across the kitchen table. I said, "Dennis, you haven't asked. You've been telling me what you'll handle." He blinked. He said I was reading too much into things. I said maybe so and poured myself more coffee. I had called my niece Sandra that October, before the joint account conversation had started repeating itself. Sandra is a paralegal, 39 years old, sharp the way women get when they've spent a decade watching what happens to people who didn't plan. I didn't tell her everything that first call. I just said I wanted to make sure my affairs were in order. She said, "Smart." The deed was already in my name alone. Walter and I had retitled the house 3 years before he died. When he got the first diagnosis, our lawyer, a woman named Patricia Rowe who wore sensible shoes and spoke in complete sentences, had walked us through it clearly. Sole ownership, sole beneficiary, no transfer on death clause that could be contested. Walter had agreed without argument. He said, "This is your house, Ruth. It was yours before it was ours, and it'll be yours after." I loved him for that sentence. I still do. Sandra reviewed everything. She told me the deed was clean. She said, "The weak points now are your accounts and your healthcare directive, and any POA you may have outstanding." I had a general power of attorney Walter and I had signed together years ago, standard boilerplate. Sandra said to revoke it and replace it with something current and specific, naming her as my agent, not Dennis, not anyone else. I called Patricia Rowe the next morning, and we met that Thursday. I did not tell Dennis. He didn't notice I had gone anywhere. I said I was having lunch with Sandra, and he nodded from behind his television program. I drove myself to Patricia's office on Oak Street, sat across from her in the same chair I had sat in when Walter was still alive, and we spent 2 hours making things airtight. The house trust was already in place. We updated my will to remove a line that had mentioned Dennis as a secondary executor, a line I had added in a softer moment. A year after he moved in, when I still believed the warmth was real, we added a clause that specified he was not entitled to remain in the house in the event of my death. We added another clause that any person currently cohabitating but not listed on the deed had 30 days to vacate. Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You're protecting yourself." That's not cold. That's sensible. I drove home and made soup. The trouble with Dennis was not that he was violent or even particularly cruel. The trouble was that he was patient in the way people are patient when they are waiting for something. He had been waiting, I understood now, from the beginning. He was 69 years old and twice divorced, and his pension was small, and his son was in another state and had 3 kids of his own to worry about. Dennis had needed a soft landing, and he had found one. He had been very careful not to blow it. His son Gary came to visit in the spring. The first visit had been fine. Gary was a big man, easy to laugh, brought a 12-pack and watched a game with his father on that oversized television. But the second visit, the one in April, was different. Gary arrived on a Thursday afternoon while I was in the yard dividing my hostas. He shook my hand and complimented the garden, and then stood there a little too long looking at the back of the house. "Nice property," he said, not like a guest, like a surveyor. That evening, Dennis said Gary was interested in real estate investment, just casually, just mentioning it. Gary had a friend who helped seniors with estate transitions, simplified things, reduced the tax burden. I set down my fork and said, "That's interesting. My affairs are already handled, but thank him for thinking of me." Dennis smiled. He said, "Gary just likes to help." I said, "I'm sure he does." I went to bed that night and updated the blue accordion folder. 2 weeks later, Dennis sat down across from me after dinner with a yellow legal pad covered in his handwriting. He had drawn a small chart. He said he had been thinking about our arrangement, about how much he contributed to the household, how it wasn't fair that his name wasn't on anything, how if something happened to me, he would be left with nothing after everything he had put in. I looked at the chart. I looked at his handwriting, which was large and slightly uneven. The handwriting of a man who doesn't write much, but wants to look official. He had written the word equity 3 times and underlined it twice. I asked him what he was proposing. He said he thought it was reasonable to add his name to the deed, just for security, just so we were both protected. He said he had looked into it and it was a simple process, just a form, really. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the yard was going dark, the hostas I had divided disappearing into the shadows. I had planted every one of them myself. Some of them came from my mother's garden, divided and transported and replanted across 3 houses over 40 years. I told him I would think about it. He nodded, satisfied, and went to watch his program. I called Sandra that night from my bedroom with the door closed. She didn't say much while I explained. She listened the way good listeners do, without filling the silence. When I finished, she said, "Ruth, don't sign anything, not one thing. Can you come in Saturday?" I said yes. She said, "Good. And in the meantime, if he puts anything in front of you, any form, any paper, any document, you look at it and you say, 'I'll have my lawyer review this first.'" I said I understood. She said, "Don't apologize when you say it. Just say it like it's the most ordinary thing in the world." That was good advice. Saturday morning, I told Dennis I was going to visit a friend. He didn't ask which one. That had been true of him for a long time, I realized. He asked about my whereabouts when he needed to, and ignored them when he didn't. I drove to Sandra's office, and we sat at her small conference table with my accordion folder open between us. And she went through each document methodically, the way Patricia Rowe had, the way women do when they're making sure something will hold. Everything held. The trust was clean. The deed was clear. The POA, named Sandra and only Sandra. The will was updated. There was nothing Dennis could attach his name to without my signature, and I was not going to give it. Sandra said, "You've been managing this longer than you think." I said, "I was a librarian for 31 years. I know how to find information before it becomes a crisis." She smiled. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store and bought new deadbolts. Not because I was afraid of him, because a house is a house and a lock is a fact. And I wanted the facts to be current. I installed them myself. It took 40 minutes and a YouTube tutorial on my phone propped up against the doorframe. Dennis came home while I was finishing the back door. He looked at the new hardware and said, "What's that about?" I said, "The old ones were loose." He stood there for a moment, uncertain, and then went inside. The legal pad with the chart never appeared again. He didn't mention the deed again directly. But things shifted in that particular way. They shift when a man realizes the plan he was counting on may not be as simple as he thought. He became quieter, less humming in the mornings, less cheerful efficiency. The performance of ease that had drawn me in 4 years ago started to show its frame, the way old furniture does when the finish wears thin and you can see the grain underneath, harder and less forgiving than it first appeared. Gary called once more. Not me directly, Dennis, but on speaker in the kitchen, which told me he wanted me to hear. Gary said he had connected with that real estate friend and the market in our area was actually quite good right now. He said the word liquidate and then caught himself and said simplify instead. I walked through the kitchen on my way to the back door and did not stop walking. That evening, Dennis asked if I had thought any more about what we'd discussed. I said yes. He leaned forward slightly. I said I had spoken with my attorney and that my affairs were fully in order and that I would not be making any changes to the property arrangements. He said, "Your attorney? You didn't tell me you were seeing an attorney." I said, "I don't tell you everything, Dennis." He stared at me. Something moved through his face that I recognized, not surprise, exactly, but the recalibration of a person who believed they knew which pieces were where and has just discovered that one of the important ones has been somewhere else the whole time. He pushed his chair back and stood and said I was being paranoid. He said he was trying to build something with me. He said that's what partners did. He used the word we 6 times in 4 sentences. I waited until he was finished. Then I said, "We is a word. It doesn't change what's in the deed." He left the room. He slept on the couch that night, which was a first. In the morning, he was formal and careful the way people are when they're deciding something. He made his own coffee. He did not offer to make mine. 3 days later, he told me he thought he needed some time to figure out what he wanted. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like he expected me to object. I told him I understood and asked if he needed help moving his things. He said he could manage. I said I'd be at Sandra's in the afternoon if he wanted to use the time. I drove to Sandra's and we had lunch, and she told me about a case she was working on, and I told her about the hostas I was planning to move to the south side of the yard. When I got home, his truck was gone. The recliner was still there. 3 boxes had been moved to the garage. The television was still on the wall. I sent him a brief message asking when he intended to collect the rest. He said he'd be in touch. I gave it 2 weeks. When he hadn't responded, I asked Patricia Rowe about next steps, and she sent a tidy letter to the address he had given me as his son's place. Formal, polite, clear. He had 30 days per the clause in my updated estate documents. He collected the recliner on a Tuesday while I was at the grocery store, which I suspect was intentional. He did not take the television. I had it removed the following Saturday. It left a clean rectangle on the wall, where the paint hadn't faded. I looked at it for a few days, and then Sandra helped me hang a print I had kept in storage, a watercolor of a harbor in Maine that Walter and I had bought on our anniversary trip 22 years ago. It fit the wall exactly. It looked like it had always been there. I did not receive a letter from Gary. I had expected one. Sometimes I think he wrote it and reconsidered. More likely, he just moved on to the next possibility. Men like Gary are not personal about it. What I think about now, on the evenings when I sit on the back porch with my coffee and watch the light change over the yard, is how easy it would have been to go differently. I think about the version of myself that might have said yes to the joint account, that might have laughed nervously at the chart on the legal pad and said, "Well, I suppose it makes sense." That might have signed something small and ordinary looking, the kind of document that seems like housekeeping until it isn't. I think about how Dennis would have accepted that graciously, how he would have made coffee without being asked for a little while afterward. I was lucky in some ways that are not really about luck. I was lucky that Walter was a thoughtful man who believed a house belonged to the person whose name was on the deed. I was lucky that I spent 31 years in a library and never lost the habit of reading things carefully before I trusted them. I was lucky that Sandra became a paralegal instead of something else. But the things that protected me were not luck. They were decisions. Specific, documented, legal decisions made with a clear head before I needed them. The week after Dennis left, I opened a new checking account. Not out of necessity, just out of the pleasure of doing something with no one else attached to it. I named it the way you name something that belongs entirely to you. I bought a new houseplant for the living room. I cooked exactly what I wanted for dinner 4 nights running. I slept diagonally across my bed for the first time since my mother used to let me sleep in her room when my father traveled, and I woke up rested in a way I hadn't been in years. Sandra came over on a Saturday. She brought good coffee and a box of pastries from the bakery on 5th. We sat at the kitchen table in the morning sun and talked about nothing important for an hour. which is sometimes the most important kind of talking. At one point, she looked around the kitchen and said, "It feels different in here." I said, "The television's gone." She said, "No, it's something else." I said, "Yes, I know." And I did know. The blue accordion folder is still on the shelf behind the embroidered pillowcases. I've added a few things to it since Dennis left. A copy of the formal letter Patricia sent. A note I wrote myself with the date I changed the locks. A small card with Sandra's office number printed on it, which I don't need because I have it memorized, but I keep it there anyway, the way you keep certain things, not because you'll need them, but because having them somewhere solid feels like evidence of something true. I was 64 when Dennis walked into my life with his easy smile and his useful hands and his long patience for the right moment. I am 68 now, and I do not regret the 4 years in the way people mean when they talk about regret. I learned things. I learned the difference between a man who helps because it matters to him and a man who helps because he's calculating the return. I learned that silence from a person you live with can mean two very different things, depending on which of you is the one being quiet. I learned that the most dangerous documents are never the large, dramatic ones. They are the small, casual ones slipped across a table after dinner when you're tired and someone you trusted is looking at you with patient eyes. I learned that prepared is not the same as paranoid. That having a lawyer is not the same as expecting the worst. That protecting what you spent your life building is not cold or unfriendly or suspicious. It is simply responsible. The same way wearing a seatbelt is responsible. The same way washing your hands is responsible. The same way reading a document before you sign it is responsible. No one calls you paranoid for doing those things. No one should. The cardinal is back on the fence post this morning. Same fence, possibly the same bird, though I know I have no way of proving that. He tilts his head again. This time he stays a little longer. Dennis thought he was patient. But patience is only an advantage when the other person isn't paying attention. I was always paying attention. If you've stayed with me this far, and if something in this story felt familiar, if you've sat across a kitchen table from someone who used the word "we" while looking at something that was only ever yours, I want you to know that the documents are the easy part. The hard part is admitting to yourself that the situation has changed while you still have time to respond to it. The hard part is making the call to the lawyer before you need one. The hard part is trusting that protecting yourself is not a betrayal of anyone who ever meant well by you. Walter always said the best time to fix the roof is before the rain. He meant it about the house. He meant it about everything. Don't wait for the rain.